He was going to hit me. I want to be clear about that because I think there's going to be a lot of conversation about interpretation and context and diplomatic nuance, and I don't want any of that to muddy the basic fact. He walked toward me and he raised his hand with intent to impact. I have been in this body for 31 years, and I know what someone looks like when they're about to hit me. He was going to hit me. I grew up in a household where my mother taught self-defense classes out of our garage on weekends. I started training when I was 7. I've been doing some form of it ever since, because she always said that the best reason to know how to protect yourself is so that the situations where you actually have to are as short and clean as possible. Get in, deal with it, get out. Don't escalate, don't perform, just handle it. That's what I did. I didn't plan the specific technique. My body chose it. That's what years of training does. It removes the decision-making lag. He committed to the strike and I was already responding before I was consciously aware of having made a choice. The redirect was automatic. The follow-through was automatic. The 2 steps back afterward, that was conscious. That was me saying with my body, I'm done. This is finished. I'm not continuing. He staggered. I know that looked dramatic to everyone watching. I want to be honest about it. I wasn't trying to stagger him. I was trying to prevent myself from being hit. The stagger was a side effect of the physics involved. I hit him in a joint that doesn't like being hit that way. The rest was just his body responding to stimulus. He's twice my height. I'm aware. His security detail had weapons. I'm aware of that too. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't scared because I was. But fear and paralysis aren't the same thing, and my mother taught me that when I was 7, standing in a garage on a Tuesday evening, and I believed her then and I believe her now. I don't know what happens next. I imagine there are people at several levels of the command structure who are very unhappy with me right now. I also don't think I had another option. Being hit by a Vethkai sub-commander in full strike doesn't leave you with a lot of future options. Anyway, statement to follow. Meetings to attend. Please send coffee, real coffee, not the vending unit stuff. Diplomatic communique. Vethkai Imperial Delegation. Transmitted to Vethara Station Directorate 1608 Station Standard Time. Translation. GDF Standard Matrix verified. The Vethkai Imperial Delegation formally notes the incident in the central atrium of Vethara Station on this date. The delegation wishes to record that Sub-Commander Vrethak Don's actions were not sanctioned by the delegation's senior diplomatic staff and do not represent the official position of the Vethkai Imperial Fleet with regard to relations under the current Accord framework. The delegation further notes, without elaboration at this time, that the response of the GDF technical specialist designated OSI was observed. Ambassador-designate Vrethana Korvesh requests a private meeting with GDF command at their earliest convenience. This meeting is requested in a spirit of candor rather than protocol. The delegation wishes to convey, informally and prior to any formal proceedings, that Sub-Commander Don is recovering satisfactorily and has expressed no desire to pursue formal complaint under Accord dispute resolution procedures. He has, in fact, expressed no desire whatsoever to revisit the incident in any official capacity. The delegation finds this understandable. Part 3. What spread? I went back to the cargo bay eventually. The loading AI had finished its recalibration and was chirping for my attention, and I had manifests to check, and the whole professional apparatus of my ordinary day was waiting. But I couldn't stop turning it over in my head. What I'd seen. The way it had moved, the way she had moved, and the way everything after had gone so very, very quiet. By the time I finished my shift and made it back to the crew quarters on Deck 11, it was everywhere. And I mean that in the specific, galactic age sense of everywhere that you maybe don't fully appreciate unless you've been on a multi-species station during a high-traffic diplomatic period. The footage, pulled from station sensors, from the personal recording devices of about a dozen beings who happened to have them active at the time, from 2 different security feeds that someone with questionable professional ethics had decided to share, was circulating through every major interspecies communication network that passed through or near Vethara. It had a title by then, several titles depending on what species was sharing it. In standard human, the most common version was something like Human deflects Vethkai strike. In Vrethani, the title translated more closely to the small being that did not move away. The Keth Collective's most shared version had a title that translated roughly to Contextual Evidence of Deathworlder Physiological Adaptation in Non-Combat Scenarios, which is somehow both more and less dramatic than the others. I watched it in my bunk that evening. I'd seen it happen live, from 30 meters up and at an angle, with ambient noise and the shock of real-time scrambling my perception. Watching it on a screen, in clean sensor quality, from 3 different camera angles simultaneously, that was a different experience. The physics of it, once you could see it properly, were almost elegant. She didn't fight the force. She borrowed it. She took the energy of his strike and used its own direction to move it past her while simultaneously removing his ability to complete the motion. And then she put a very precise counterinput into the system, his joint, that caused everything to cascade the wrong way for him. The most watched camera angle was the one from the west-facing sensor array, because it gave you the clearest view of his expression in the 5 seconds after. I don't have the vocabulary for Vethkai facial expressions. I'm not sure anyone on our side of the galaxy fully does. But whatever that expression was in those 5 seconds, it wasn't anger. It wasn't pain exactly, or not only pain. It was something that looked, and I know how this sounds, a lot like recalibration. Like watching someone's entire understanding of a situation update in real time. My roommate on Deck 11 was a Chenthali cargo tech named Save, who had been on Vethara for 3 years and knew the station and everyone on it better than most. She came in while I was watching the footage and stood in the doorway for a moment. "You saw it live," she said. "From Deck 7, I said. She made the Chenthali sound that means something between interesting and I need to sit down. Then she came and sat on the edge of her bunk and watched the footage with me for a while without saying anything. "Sub-Commander Don is not a being known for poor decisions," she said eventually. "He made one today," I said. "Yes," she watched for another moment. "That's the part that matters, not what she did. Everyone is going to talk about what she did, but what matters is what he did, and then what she did, and then what he did next." "Which was nothing," I said. "Which was nothing," Save agreed. "He stood there and he looked at her and he did nothing. And that is what every military analyst in the Accord is going to spend the next 6 months thinking about." I thought about that for a while. "His security detail didn't move either," I said. "No," said Save, "they didn't." Fleet Admiral Yena Akafer, GDF Command. Personal account, recorded for internal archive, 2 days after the incident. I've been in the GDF for 23 years. I've been dealing with interspecies incidents at the diplomatic level for the last 12 of those years. I've seen fights, I've seen misunderstandings that became fights, and I've seen deliberate provocations that were designed to escalate into something that could be used politically. I've also seen genuine moments of contact between species, the kind that don't fit any existing category and end up creating new ones. This was the last kind. I want to be careful about how I frame this, because there are a lot of ways to get it wrong. The easiest wrong way is to make it about what Warrant Officer Ose did physically. She handled a threat efficiently. That's real, and it matters, and anyone who has spent time studying human close combat tradition will tell you that what she did is a specific and sophisticated application of principles that humans have spent a long time developing. But that's not what this incident is actually about. What this incident is about is a sub-commander of the Vethkai Imperial Fleet. a species that has been part of the Galactic Accord for roughly 400 years, who have fought 3 interspecies wars, who have a military tradition that is older than most of human written history, making an assumption. The assumption was that the being standing in front of him would absorb his strike. That assumption was wrong. His arm is fine now. The medical team confirmed full recovery. He's physically unharmed. But the footage has been seen, at this point, by roughly 60% of the beings currently on Vethara Station, and we're tracking versions of it spreading through at least 14 interspecies networks. It's already been seen by beings who are not on Vethara Station. And what those beings are seeing is the moment when Subcommander Don's assumption about a human failed him. That is not a small thing. I've had 3 informal conversations in the last 48 hours, one with the Vethkai ambassador-designate, one with a senior Vrethani diplomatic aide, and one with the commander of the Gorvathi security contingent on station. All 3 conversations shared the same subtext. They all wanted to know, without asking directly, whether Warrant Officer Osai was typical. I didn't answer that question directly either. I said she was a GDF warrant officer who had served her posting with distinction. I said the GDF took the training and readiness of its personnel seriously. I said we were proud of how our people handled difficult situations. What I did not say, because it would have been both impolitic and unkind to say directly, she is not an outlier. She is not the anomaly. She is not the exception that proves the rule. She is what a human who grew up training looks like, and there are quite a lot of humans who grew up training. I think the Vethkai ambassador-designate understood that. Her expression, when I'd finished my carefully non-answer, was one that I've learned to associate with a being updating a prior assumption. It was the same expression Subcommander Don had on his face in the footage. The summit opens tomorrow. I expect this incident will be a significant undercurrent of every conversation for the next 3 days, whether it's officially on the agenda or not. Warrant Officer Osai has been reassigned to administrative duties for the duration of the summit, not as a punitive measure, but because her face has become very recognizable on the station very quickly, and recognizable faces at diplomatic summits tend to create complications. She was philosophical about it. She asked if there was real coffee available in the administrative section. I made sure there was. Part 4. The meeting THAT wasn't official. Ambassador-designate Vrethana Korvesh of the Vethkai Imperial Delegation requested the private meeting, and Fleet Admiral Akafor agreed to it. What follows is not an official transcript, because neither party wanted it to be one. It is a reconstruction based on the accounts of both parties, recorded separately, which align closely enough that the reconstruction is considered reliable. They met in one of the smaller conference rooms on Deck 3, neutral territory. As most of Deck 3 was considered on Vethara Station, the furniture scaled to accommodate most Accord species comfortably, if not perfectly. A window looking out at the stars coming through the Cassavith Nebula on the edge of the system. The room smelled like recycled air, and the faint mineral undertone that Vethkai environmental systems always left when they'd been run in a space recently. Ambassador-designate Korvesh was not what most humans expected from a Vethkai military diplomat. She was older, old enough that her secondary sensory apparatus along the jaw had gone a silvery gray, and she moved with a deliberateness that was less physical caution than intellectual precision. Everything she did suggested someone who chose each action because they'd already thought 3 steps past it. She sat across the table from Akafor, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was apparently acceptable to both parties. Then Korvesh said, in Standard, which she spoke with only a slight processing delay through the translation matrix, "The footage is accurate." "I know," said Akafor. "He intended to strike her." "I know that too." A pause. "It is a source of significant internal tension within the delegation," Korvesh said carefully. Sub-Commander Don is not a fool. He is not impulsive by training or nature. He has served with distinction in 3 separate fleet operations, and his record is, she paused, seeming to select the word, exemplary. Then why, Akafor said equally carefully, did he do it? Corvesh looked at her with those deep-set pale eyes for a long moment. He looked at her, Corvesh said, and he saw a small being from a primitive world that has been in the Accord for less than a generation. He has looked at humans before and seen the same thing. He has looked at humans before and been correct about what he saw: beings who defer to the existing hierarchy, who understand their position, who know that a Vethkai sub-commander in full regalia is someone to navigate around rather than stand in front of. She paused again. He was not correct this time. No, said Akafor. The question I have for you, Corvesh said, and now her voice shifted into something a little more direct, is whether that incorrectness is specific to this individual being, or whether it is systematic. Akafor took a breath. Warrant Officer Os has been training in close-quarters combat methodology since she was 7 years old, she said. Her specific disciplines include a human tradition called Judo, which is approximately 140 years old as a codified system, and is built around the principle of using an opponent's momentum and mass against them rather than opposing it directly. She also has training in 2 other close-quarters systems. She was physically capable of what you saw before she ever joined the GDF. Her GDF service added additional training on top of that. Corvesh listened. She is not, Akafor continued, statistically unusual among humans who join the GDF. A significant proportion of our personnel have childhood exposure to some form of close-quarters training. It is a widespread cultural practice. Humans train their offspring to physically defend themselves from an early age. It has been this way for all of recorded human history, essentially. We are a species that was prey before we were predator, on a world that has significantly more apex predator class fauna than is average for inhabited worlds. We adapted. She let that sit for a second. The Deathworlder classification that the Accord assigned Earth, she said, is not symbolic. It is an assessment of actual conditions. Warrant Officer Osai is not extraordinary. She is a person who grew up on a death world and trained to function within it, and then received additional training on top of that. Sub-Commander Don encountered the baseline output of those conditions. Corvesh was quiet for a while. I have read the Deathworlder classification reports, she said eventually. I have read the atmospheric toxicity indices, the predatory fauna assessments, the environmental stress ratings. I understood them as data. A pause. I am not certain I understood them as lived experience. Most species don't, said Akafor without any edge in it. The data is accurate. The data is just very hard to make visceral without context. Sub-Commander Don now has context, Corvesh said. And Akafor smiled just slightly. He does, she agreed. There was a longer silence after that. Corvesh looked out at the Cassavith Nebula through the window. The light coming through it was amber and pale blue at the edges, the way it always was in the mid-morning of Vethara's station cycle. There is a thing I should tell you, Corvesh said at last, and I am telling you in this room, informally, because I believe it is more useful to you than it is politically delicate for us. I'm listening, said Akafor. Sub-Commander Don's arm recovered fully. You know this. What you may not know is that he has spent the last 2 days reviewing footage of human close combat methodology. A pause. Extensively. Akafor raised an eyebrow. He has asked our delegation's intelligence attaché for access to any archived records of human military training documentation that are available through standard Accord channels, Corvesh continued. He has specifically asked about the discipline your warrant officer used, and 3 others that have been flagged in Accord military analysis reports. Judo, probably, Akafor said, and maybe Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, and either wrestling or Sambo. Corvesh looked at her with an expression that might have been wry. Your intelligence is good. We know what gets analyzed, said Akafor. We know which of our disciplines attract attention. He is not angry, Corvesh said. I want you to understand that. There was a period of approximately 6 hours where his emotional state was complex. But what has settled is not anger. What has settled is something more like. She seemed to search for the word in standard, recalibration. I've heard that word used to describe his expression in the footage, said Akafor. It is apt, Corvesh said simply. He made an assumption. The assumption was wrong. He is a military commander. He adjusts his data. A pause. He also, Corvesh added, in a tone that was just barely lighter, asked whether there were human close combat instructors on station who might be available for consultation. Akafor blinked. Then she laughed very softly. I'll see what I can arrange, she said. Part 5. What happened at the summit? The Vethara Diplomatic Accord Summit opened on schedule 3 days after the incident. The incident was not on the official agenda. It was never officially discussed, never raised in formal session, never entered into any of the public records of the summit proceedings. If you looked only at the official documentation, you would have no idea it had happened. But it was present in every room. I know this because one of the beings I work with on the cargo team has a sibling who works in diplomatic catering, the species-specific meal preparation service that runs for multi-species summits, and her sibling spent 3 days moving in and out of session rooms and corridor conversations and private meetings, largely invisible in the way that service workers are largely invisible, and came back with impressions. The impressions were consistent. The beings at that summit were thinking about humans differently than they had been before. Not dramatically differently, not in the ways that you see in the historical vids about first contact moments, the ones where someone makes a grand speech and the music swells. Subtler than that. More the way that you think about something differently when you've learned one new fact about it that quietly reorganizes everything you thought you already knew. The Gorvathi security commander, a veteran with nearly 40 years of interspecies military service, apparently spent a significant amount of time during one of the formal recess periods talking to 2 of his aides in low tones while watching footage of human athletic competitions on a personal display. Not combat footage. Athletic competitions. Running specifically, and then swimming, and then something called competitive gymnastics. The Vrethani senior aide who'd spoken with Fleet Admiral Akafor apparently requested access to the GDF's publicly available physical readiness assessments for standard personnel. The Chinthali trade delegation, of all people, put in a formal request for a briefing on Earth's geological history and tectonic activity levels, which seems unrelated until you understand that tectonic activity is one of the primary drivers of the kind of variable, high-stress environmental conditions that produce the specific physiological resilience profiles associated with Deathworlder classification. And Sub-Commander Vrethak Dawn, who attended the summit in his official capacity as a military advisory presence for the Vethkai delegation, sat through 3 days of sessions and by all accounts said very little. He watched. He listened. When he was required to speak, he spoke precisely and without his earlier register of casual dominance. One witness, a Keth collective liaison who sat near the Vethkai section for most of the formal sessions, described his bearing during the summit as appropriately adjusted. I have no idea if the Vethkai have a word for humbled, but that's the closest translation available. Personal account save Chinthali Cargo Tech Vethara Station. Recorded at the request of GDF Cultural Documentation Unit, 6 weeks after the incident. I want to say something that I think is important and that I haven't seen in any of the official accounts. When the footage spread through the station in the first day or two after the incident, most of the conversation I heard was about the human, about what she did, about the technique, about what it meant that a human had done that to a Vethkai sub-commander. And I understand why. It was dramatic, and it was visible, and it was the part that looked impressive. But I kept thinking about something else. After the incident, after Warrant Officer Osai had taken her 2 steps back and was standing there with her hands at her sides, there was a moment. I've watched the footage many times now. There's a moment, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, where everything is still. She's looking at him. He's looking at her. His security detail is there but not moving. Everyone on the transit floor is frozen. And what happens next is that she doesn't escalate. She took 2 steps back. She put her hands down. She stopped. She gave him the space to decide what came next, and she waited to see what he would choose. She stopped. That is the part that I keep thinking about. Because stopping, having done what she'd done, knowing what she knew about the situation, knowing his security detail was right there, stopping takes a specific kind of confidence. You only stop when you believe that stopping is safe. You only believe that stopping is safe when you trust your own ability to respond to whatever comes next. She stopped because she wasn't afraid of what he might do. She stopped because she'd already shown both of them what she was capable of doing, and she knew it, and she trusted it, and so she could afford to give him the choice. He chose nothing. He stood there and let it end. That to me is the whole story, not the technique, not the impact. The moment when 2 beings, one enormous, one small, one with 400 years of Accord history behind him, one from a species that has been a member for less than a generation, stood in a neutral transit floor, and both of them decided not to continue. Humans get described a lot, in Accord species cultural materials, as aggressive, violent. The Deathworlder classification and the history of human warfare and the general reputation that precedes them creates this impression of a species that defaults to force. But what I saw that day was a human who used force exactly as much as the situation required and then stopped. Precisely, cleanly, without drama. I don't think that's what most non-humans expect when they think about what humans do. I think Sub-Commander Dawn was expecting something more like what he would have done, which is continue, establish dominance, make the moment a statement. She made it a resolution instead. I think he's still thinking about that. I think a lot of beings who watched that footage are still thinking about that. Part 6, DARA. I met her 6 weeks after the incident. Not deliberately, again. Not deliberately. Again, the cargo bay, again the loading AI in a recalibration loop, again me with time to kill. I'd ended up in the station's lower common area, which is a wide room on Deck 9 that has flexible furniture and bad vending units, and a view of the docking arm that is not exactly scenic, but is at least different from looking at cargo manifests. I was eating something the vending unit had called a nutrient-balanced protein substitute wrap, and trying to decide if I could complain about it to anyone. She came in and got something from the vending unit and sat down 2 tables away and looked at her food with the same expression I imagine I had. I didn't recognize her at first. It had been 6 weeks and I'd seen her once from 30 meters up, and the footage had become so ubiquitous that my brain had somehow separated person in footage from person who actually exists. Then she shifted in her seat and I caught her profile, and my brain made the connection. I stared for probably 1 second too long, and she noticed. She glanced over, I looked away, she went back to her food, I went back to mine. Then she said without looking up, "You can ask." I looked over. "Everyone wants to ask," she said, still looking at her food but without any particular irritation in it. 6 weeks later and people still want to ask. It's fine, go ahead. "Were you scared?" I said. She looked up then. "Yes," she said. "Really?" "Really?" She took a bite of her food and made a face at it. I want to be clear that I'm not one of those people who's going to tell you I wasn't scared. I was scared. He was huge and his security detail was right there, and I was standing on a transit floor where I wasn't even supposed to be. I was very scared. But you didn't freeze, I said. No, she said. Fear and freezing aren't the same thing. My mother told me that when I was 7. I've had a long time to make sure she was right. We sat with that for a moment. The meetings afterward, I said, was it? A lot, she said. It was a lot of meetings. A small pause. Mostly fine, actually. The GDF they were good about it. Fleet Admiral Akafer was good about it. The Vethkai delegation sent a formal note of acknowledgement that was worded very carefully, but was essentially them saying they understood that Sub-Commander Don had initiated contact. Nobody called it an assault. Everybody kind of navigated around the actual word, but the meaning was clear. And him, I asked. She smiled just slightly. It was a complicated smile. He asked for a meeting, she said. I blinked. Formal request through proper channels. Ambassador-designate Corvesh submitted it on his behalf. He wanted to speak to me directly. Did you go? After about 3 days of thinking about it, she said, yes. What did he say? She looked at her food for a moment, then she looked at me. He asked me to explain what I did, she said. The technique, the specific choices. He wanted to understand it mechanically. A pause, and he asked whether I had been afraid. What did you tell him? I told him yes. She said it simply, without drama, and for a moment I could see the whole thing. A 31-year-old human woman from Earth sitting across from a twice-her-height Vethkai sub-commander who had tried to hit her 3 days earlier, and telling him, yes, I was afraid. He was quiet for a while, she said. And then he said the translation was a little rough, but the Matrix rendered it as, he said that in 400 years of Accord military service, the Vethkai had not previously encountered a species that was afraid and continued anyway in the way that humans do. He said that in Vethkai training doctrine, visible fear in a being smaller than you is a signal that the encounter is resolved. He said he had seen her fear. She paused. He could smell it, she said. Vethkai's secondary sensory apparatus, chemical signals. He knew I was afraid, and he struck anyway because he expected the fear to complete the encounter, for me to step back, to defer. A pause. He didn't expect the fear to be irrelevant. I sat with that. He apologized, she added. Formally, in the Vethkai tradition, which involves a specific verbal acknowledgement of incorrect assessment rather than intent to harm, which is interesting, right? The apology structure assumes that the wrong was an error in assessment, not in decision to proceed. It's honest, actually. He did what he did because he assessed the situation wrong. He got the apology right. How did it end? She smiled again, that complicated smile. He asked if I would be willing to demonstrate the technique again, she said, slowly, for educational purposes. A pause, in a proper training room with safety equipment, and with his arm recovered first. Another pause, and with his explicit and repeated assurance that he was asking as a student, not as a commander. I stared at her. Did you? I did, she said, for 3 hours. Silence. He's a fast learner, she said. Part 7, What It Meant. GDF Cultural Integration Division, Quarterly Report Extract. Submitted 8 months after the Vethara Station incident. The Vethara Station incident, File 7741 Delta Human, has produced effects that extend beyond its immediate diplomatic context. 8 months of observation and documented response allow for some preliminary assessment of its wider impact. In terms of immediate diplomatic outcome, the Vethara Accord Summit concluded successfully, with all scheduled agenda items resolved or tabled for further sessions. The incident did not derail proceedings. It may, in ways that are difficult to measure precisely, have contributed to an atmosphere in which Vethkai delegation members treated human GDF personnel with a degree of additional consideration that is anecdotally noted in multiple observer accounts. In terms of wider perception shifts, survey data collected from multi-species personnel on Vethara Station in the months following the incident shows statistically significant changes in how non-human species rate their agreement with statements about human physical capability, training culture, and behavioral patterns under threat. The changes are consistent across species groups and are large enough to exceed expected survey variance. In plainer language, beings who saw the footage or heard detailed accounts of the incident updated their assessments of humans. The direction of the update varied somewhat by species background, but the consistent common thread was an increased awareness of what might be called the training gap. The difference between what non-human species expected of humans based on human physical parameters, smaller than average, shorter-lived than average, lower baseline sensory capability than several accord species, and what humans actually demonstrated when those parameters were tested in real conditions. There is an ongoing discussion in academic xenocultural circles about the Deathworlder classification and whether it is sufficiently weighted in accord species active threat capability assessments versus being treated as a historical data point. The Vethara Station incident has reinvigorated this discussion. The most significant measurable change is this: GDF standard personnel are reported more frequently by non-human accord species in multi-species postings as being treated with what survey respondents describe as appropriate respect. Several respondents, when asked to specify what they meant by this, referenced the Vethara Station incident specifically. A smaller number referenced it in terms suggesting they had communicated about it to others before encountering GDF personnel directly. In other words, the footage traveled, the lesson traveled with it. On an anecdotal note that falls outside the scope of formal reporting, but which the authors of this section feel is worth including, Subcommander Vrethak Don was, as of 6 months after the incident, pursuing formal training in 2 human close combat disciplines through the Accord's Interspecies Cultural Exchange Program. He has apparently proved a highly dedicated student. When asked by the human instructor assigned to his training cohort why he was pursuing this coursework, he reportedly said, translation rendered through the standard matrix as, "Because I was wrong, and I prefer to understand the things that proved me wrong." The instructor rated this as an unusually good starting attitude for a student. Station Common Room, Deck 9. Save Chinthali Cargo Tech, final personal account. I still see Dara sometimes. She's a warrant officer in the diplomatic support team, and I'm a cargo tech, and our paths cross the way paths cross on a station, in the common areas, in the corridors, occasionally at the same bad vending unit. She's the same as she was before as far as I can tell. She does her job. She monitors atmospheric scrubbers and shows up at meetings and drinks coffee when she can get the real kind. She didn't ask for the incident to happen, and she didn't ask for the footage to spread, and she definitely didn't ask for her face to be the one that beings across 14 interspecies networks associate with a lesson about humans. But she seems okay with it, mostly. I asked her once, a few months after, if it had changed anything for her. If moving through the station was different now that everyone knew who she was. She thought about it for a while. People make more eye contact, she said. Non-human personnel, they didn't used to as much. Now they do. A pause. It's nice, actually. Eye contact is a kind of acknowledgement. You're not invisible when someone makes eye contact with you. She ate her nutrient substitute wrap, which still tasted bad, because the vending unit still made bad food regardless of what had happened to anyone's galaxy-wide reputation. My mother always said, she said, that the goal isn't to be impressive. The goal is to be standing at the end, and for the other person to be standing too, and for everyone to have more information than they started with. She said that's what every encounter should end with: more information, less wrong assumptions. She paused. Sub-Commander Don has more information, she said. I have more information. The beings who watched that footage have more information. Even you have more information. She looked at me. Is that not how it should end? She said. I thought about it for a while. Yeah, I said. I think that's exactly how it should end. Epilogue: the station remembers. Vethara Station keeps records. It keeps them the way old stations do, in accumulated layers, not all in the same format, not all in the same database, not all accessible through the same interface. The loading AI that recalibrated and gave me 2 hours of wandering time that morning is part of the same system that holds, in a completely different archive tier, the sensor footage of the central atrium on the day of the incident. The same station that watched and recorded also forgot to recalibrate on schedule, and that small mechanical failure sent a human cargo tech to the wrong deck at the wrong time to stand at a railing and watch something she was not supposed to see. I think about that sometimes. The accidental nature of witnessing. How most of the history that matters is accumulated by people who wandered into the wrong place at the right moment and stood there long enough for it to mean something. The Vethara Accord Summit produced 47 official documents. Most of them are available through the standard Accord public records system. They cover trade frameworks, defense coordination protocols, species-specific diplomatic accommodations for the next treaty cycle, environmental standards for station construction in contested regions of the outer systems. None of them mention Warrant Officer Dara Osai. None of them mention Sub-Commander Vrethak Dawn, except in his formal capacity as a Vethkai military advisory representative. None of them mention a transit floor on a morning in station cycle, and a strike that didn't land, and 5 seconds of silence that somehow became a conversation that the whole galaxy had without ever quite saying it out loud. The official documents don't mention any of that. But the records are there, the footage is there. The accounts are there, filed in a GDF archive under reference 7741 Delta Human, accessible to anyone with the right clearance. And the change is there, in survey data, in diplomatic observer notes, in the 3-hour training session in a room with safety equipment and a recovered arm, in a Vethkai sub-commander who enrolled in a human close combat program because he was wrong and preferred to understand the things that proved him wrong. The change is there. And somewhere on this station, in the crew quarters on Deck 11, there is a cargo tech who wanders when the loading AI recalibrates, who stood at a railing on Deck 7 with a bad cup of approximated coffee, and watched a 31-year-old human woman from Earth change the shape of a morning in ways that neither of them fully understood yet. I was not supposed to be there. I am very glad I was. Some things don't get written into the official record. They get written into the people who saw them, into the way they tell the story afterward, into the long echo of the moment when one species showed another what it actually was, and the other species had the grace to update what it knew. The galaxy is a large place. It is full of assumptions. Some of them are wrong. Every now and then, something happens to correct the record. And sometimes the correction lasts.